So welcome to Save Your Family Treasures, a program that we were excited to hear about. A little nervous because we're all in the thick of mucking out, but this is the time that you want to save your family treasures. So we were approached by the Vermont Department of Libraries to bring this to Ludlow, and we appreciate you all being here. We have Carolyn here, who's a local person from Chester. Her business is Works on Paper from Bellows Falls. She's a conservator who does all kinds of this work all the time. And I sense her passion in her voice when she talks about it. And we have Caitlin, who is the disaster response coordinator from the Smithsonian. And they can tell you exactly how they put this workshop together, and then you can get down and dirty with all these wonderful artifacts. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Thanks, Michelle. And thanks, guys, for coming, too. We're going to try to make this very approachable and practical. And if you have questions at any time, there's just enough in here. Just kidding. But there's plenty of talking space and room for that. So I'm Caitlin Everett. I'm the Disaster Response Coordinator with the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative. I work remotely for the Smithsonian. I'm up in Richmond, Vermont, so I came down here for the day to bring this to you. This is called the Save Your Family Treasures program. The Smithsonian has been putting this on since 2016, and we've moved this program to disasters all across the United States. I've personally been in South Carolina and Nebraska, Florida, and USVI, and then this program has gone to places like North Carolina, Texas, Iowa, Puerto Rico, you name it, and it's kind of been there. There's been a disaster. So we're really happy to be bringing this to Vermont today. And Carolyn has been gracious enough to join us as well, so we appreciate that. And then just a little bit more too, so the program itself was brought here by, as Michelle mentioned, the Vermont Department of Libraries, and this is through its affiliation and our affiliation with the group called VACDARN. That's the Vermont Arts and Culture Disaster and Resilience Network. They've been wonderful throughout this terrible time in sort of activating each different level of arts and cultural institution across the state and mobilizing, all of the resources that they have at their disposal in order to bring both these type of programs and additional assistance to, again, arts and cultural, historical, library, you name it, they've brought it there for this thing. So again, we're really happy to be here today. I'm going to talk really quickly just about what you can expect and give you some general tips for salvaging family heirlooms, and then we're going to jump into some demonstrations led by Carolyn and myself for different and specific types of media that you can be expecting to bring out of your home following an event like the flooding we just had. So before we begin, and the thing we always begin with is personal safety, and that's of utmost importance to us. And so you'll see Carolyn wearing her nitrile gloves. I'm going to put my nitrile gloves on right now. Everything that we do today is going to be while we wear these. We wear these because these are the most effective against any of the chemicals and toxins that you're going to be finding in the water that has been in your homes and basements. They stand up the best to again, the different level of exposure that you can find. So we always recommend having a pair of these on your hands at all times. These can be doubled up or strengthened by putting on a pair of work gloves. So you can put a pair of work gloves on over these guys if you're going to be working with, again, things that you can't see or you can't feel always. Feel free to put these over, but we always recommend, again, keeping your nitrile gloves on underneath. And then what Carolyn just pulled out is your N95 mask, and we also recommend you wearing one of these at all times during your salvage because this is what's going to protect you against any mold growth, any of the particulates that are in the air from dust or sometimes soot, but not so much in this case, but definitely a lot of those, anything that can get in the air can get in your mouth. This is going to help keep out for you. And then you heard me too say that these are the things you wear. Oh, we also have some safety glasses too, and you feel free to put these on if you need them, or if you feel like you could be splashing anything in your eyes. They're good for that. But so you've heard me say, and an apron as well. We have aprons here too. Feel free again.
Yes, aprons are also good.
Definitely. So you've heard me say the word salvage, and we'll keep saying the word salvage because that is primarily what we're going to be talking about today. Carolyn's a conservator. But what we're going to be demonstrating isn't conservation, okay? It's not preservation or restoration. This is salvage, which means that we're going to be pulling items out of your home, and we're going to focus on stabilization, so making sure that they're able to be handled at a future date, and then and making sure that, again, that you can save them and you can continue to have them rather than being getting to a place where you can't ever access them again. After the stabilization or the salvage process, if at a later time you find that you need a conservator, there are resources available to you to bring your items to for that need. And then before we launch into the activities, which I think we're just about ready to do, we have 3 more things that you're going to be hearing on repeat throughout this demonstration. The first is rinsing. One of the things that we recommend is the 3 rinse system, and you see trays here. This is where we're going to be doing a good deal of our demonstrating. It's a 3 rinse. You move your object from one to the next in a consecutive process of rinsing to get all of the toxins off, and so eventually you're coming out with a much cleaner product than you began with. During that process, we also recommend using distilled water. This is better than tap water. This is better than hose water. But if those are the only things available to you at the time, you can certainly use this as well. This is going to make sure that you're not introducing any unknown chemicals or other, help me out here.
So depending on whether you have town water or well water, you might have different minerals in your water. It might be treated, if you're in town, with chlorine, and those are things that we prefer not to introduce to materials if we can help it. But I would also reiterate what Caitlin said, is like if all you have is your tap water or your hose water, that's really going to be better than doing nothing. So
yeah.
Distilled water is #1 choice, but we also recognize that is always not a practical solution when you're in the midst of really doing this initial disaster retrieval.
Yeah.
Right now it's 17 days. A lot of that stuff has been taken out and put in the position, somewhere where it's dry, but it's still a mess. I think what I'm interested in is finding somebody, because of all the catastrophe, that can do that for me, and that's what I would like.
Definitely. So we'll go over some things, because a lot of the things that you'll see can be re-wet and cleaned. So if you have, and Carolyn's going to talk about this first and foremost, but if you have photos, this is a really good example of something that likely has gotten mucky and muddy and probably stuck together, and what seems like you can't get it apart. So we're going to talk about some different ways that you can clean these things and rinse them off, dry them, and then get them to a place where, again, you can have them again for your future. And this is something too that if you learn about this, maybe we can talk to our neighbors and we can start distributing the work as well, because it's understandable that when you have an entire basement worth of heirlooms and things that you want to save, it can seem like a very daunting and difficult task. So being able to learn these different techniques and help our neighbors and our friends with this, it's hopefully we can make the process easier.
It's a good, like, many hands make light
Exactly.
work. So it's something that you can show to people once you've done this workshop with us. We have other resources available, and you can get a group of friends together, get your setup going, and start doing some of that salvage technique.
Exactly. Exactly.
We do a lot when I do disaster response on site. It's always a group of people, and it just goes much better, and it's nice to have the support and the camaraderie too.
Yeah.
Like doing it with a group.
Absolutely. So the other 2 things you'll hear too about are different drying techniques. These are different things that you can do in order to dry materials. It's going to vary depending on what type of material you have. So we're going to go over those ways. And then the 3rd thing you're going to hear a lot is about freezing. And then this is going to be something that, again, you're going to hear is different for each type of material that we discussed. But the one thing to remember is that freezing an object is just a time-buying technique, okay? It's not actually going to solve your problem. It's not going to get rid of any of the moisture that's in a book or in a document. But what it means is that you can put it aside and you don't have to worry about mold growth on it, and you can come back to it at a later time when you have more time or more space or whatever it is that you need in order to address that issue. And as I just said the word space, that reminds me that one of the things that you should think about before you begin or before you come back to any of your materials is coming up with a space and a plan for how you're going to deal with things. it may seem like you only have one photo book, but when you start taking each photo out and drying each one of these at a time, you'll find very quickly that you're going to come up with an entire room's worth of space to use for drying purposes. So come up with a plan, have an area that you plan to go to. We recommend that it's outside of the affected area, the basement or whatever it was that got wet, and come up with a strategy for how you're going to deal with that. Now I'll stop talking because I think I've been doing it a lot. I'll let Carolyn start. And again, feel free to jump in with any questions, and we'll get it.
Great. So I'm Carolyn. As Caitlin and Michelle said, I'm a paper conservator in private practice. I also have a lot of experience in disaster response through another nationwide organization, which were the National Heritage Response Team. So I had actually just been trained in that in 2010. So I was here in Vermont during Irene. So it's kind of sad to be doing this all over again, but I think that's sort of where we are. So I'm going to talk about primarily photographs, books, and paper, and a lot of the techniques I'm going to show you are applicable to all of those materials. So it's going to be a little bit repetitive, but I'm hoping, by the end of this workshop, you'll have a good idea of what you can do at home. I'm going to be a repeat of Caitlin and say, it's really important that you wear gloves. If I were working on actual materials that had been in a flood, I would want to have my respirator on. I really noticed with this particular incident in my response up in Barrie, here in Proctorsville, once the flood waters and all the stuff that came off the mountain dries, it's incredibly fine particulate silt. And you really don't want to be breathing that in. Sort of what I tell people when I teach disaster response or go on site and I'm helping in an active scene, is just think about what you have in your garage or your basement in terms of chemicals, paint, all those things that we need to take to toxic waste disposal day, and don't do it, and then just multiply that exponentially plus sewage, and that's what's in the water, that's what's in that silt. So really making sure that you're protecting yourself and the other people that you're working with. These would not be the shoes that I would be wearing. I would want to wear a protective footwear too if you're doing that initial retrieval and things are wet. So I'm going to jump in and talk first about photographs. I think that's something that people have a lot of, often with sentimental value, and you want to salvage those. When we're retrieving photographs that are wet, unless you're a super organized person and have put them into albums, you might often pull out something like this. So it's a stack of photographs that have stuck together. Until recently, most photographic prints are printed with materials that get very sticky when they're wet, primarily gelatin. So here's my wet stack of photographs. I don't want to take this and start peeling them away right now as I pull them out as a stack, because what can happen is that they could already start to really stick to each other and they'll peel the surface of the photographic image off. So if I retrieve it, I'm going to put it on my screen here, and this is just fiberglass screen that you can buy at the hardware store. It's useful. You'll see us use this over and over again. I use this in my conservation studio all the time for non-disaster tasks when I'm handling wet objects. So this is a good way to support anything that's wet and likely to be very weak when it's wet. So I'm going to put my stack of stuck together photographs in this tray, and I want them to get nice and wet here. And what will happen is over time, and the time will vary depending on what type of photograph it is, how long they've been sticking to each other, they'll start to come loose. And you can kind of encourage them by shaking, very gentle peeling. And it might be, if you start to sort of lift it up very carefully and it's resisting and it's sticking, that means you just walk away and come back. It might take a couple of hours, but usually they will eventually separate while they're immersed in the bath. So we can pretend that.
So the stack of photos
that was wet is now on a screen
It's on a screen.
and submerged in water.
Submerged in water. Oh, yes. So, and if yes, go ahead.
Right now, being 17 days, what happens is the photos that were all wet are now dry.
Right. So this is what Caitlin was starting to say. So with, these more sort of 20th century prints, especially, what you can do is when you have the space and sort of enough time, you can work in small batches and do this exact technique. So you would take, a stack of photographs that are stuck together, put them on, you can cut down pieces of the fiberglass screen and immerse them in a tray of water and just wait.
A dry photo can get wet again.
It can get wet again.
So this is no problem. Yeah.
And I think
They were born in water,
They
so
were
you can
born
put
in
them back in water, basically. That's my non-conservation.
yes, basically all paper was born in water, and photographic prints were developed in solutions of water and other chemicals. So in this particular flooding event, you probably saw this on your materials, there's often a lot of the silt and the mud and the muck. If your photograph is totally dry and not stuck together, you might want to go through the washing process. You also might decide you're going to do the dry cleaning process, and I can talk about that once we get through this. But if they're stuck together, really the best thing that you can do yourself is try to get them wet again and let them float apart. One thing that I recommend, is if you have a phone that has a camera, before you get them wet again, is you can take a few pictures of them just so you have a backup record of what you can see.
Is there a limit to how long they can stay in the water?
I mean, I have left them overnight.
Okay.
I don't like to do that, but there have been, I would start, again, like your ideal setup would be starting in the morning, starting with, don't put them all in together if you have a bunch of different stacks. Start with one stack that's stuck together.
You can see too, maybe after we're done too, we'll throw another batch, I have another batch of photos, and you just basically agitate them a little bit, so you're just sort of moving them around a little, and you'll see whether or not they're coming apart. If they're not coming apart, give them a little more time. If they are, start, again, continue the agitation process and see if you can get them free.
And then in my batch here, some of them have started coming apart. There's a few that are still stuck together. But if you're getting your photographs wet or they're already wet and you're starting in this initial washing tray, you can take a soft, synthetic, not expensive brush from the hardware store for paint, and you just very lightly, while the photograph is completely immersed down in the water, just gently brush. And that's gonna brush that fine silt away. So that's another technique you can use to remove some of the silt. So then you're gonna take your photographs on their screen here and let it drain off a little bit. And you can see they really do stay on the screen. I can angle it a little bit to drain. And then you move into your next bath. And this would be if they were all unstuck. Rinsing here. And the idea is that you're just going through this series of baths, and hopefully by the third bath, you've removed the silt and the muck and most of the chemicals. For photographs that are really stuck together, I would probably make a deeper bath so that they can really be completely saturated by the water. So by the time you get to your last bath, if these were all separated, just pretend, you want to make sure that you don't let them dry like this, because what's going to happen? They're all going to stick back to each other again. So what we like to do, this is where you have to kind of be, photographs especially, in your last tray here, you could carefully pick them up by the edges out of the tray and lay them out. And it's always safer, if you're working like this and you have sort of a cluster of photographs, my recommendation is to go ahead and separate them completely while they're in the water, because they're gonna be much more slippery and easier to separate from water. So what I would not do, like, see, this is still pretty stuck. It just, of course, came off. But what can happen is if it's really stuck, the emulsion where the photographic image is will like pull away like sort of a thin film of rubber. So these, I wouldn't try to peel apart yet. I would just let them soak. And it might take 2 hours, it might take 8 hours. I also kind of think, depending on the importance of the photograph, if you leave it overnight and it starts to, it really shouldn't dissolve, but I mean, you're already kind of starting with loss in a way anyway, so if you feel like the risk of maybe losing a little bit of image with a longer soaking is less than the risk of getting them separated, you can try it. As Caitlin mentioned, a lot of the times we have a lot of photographs, so another option, you can also lay them out on a towel. You want to use a towel that isn't going to bleed into them. I think most of our bath towels, are pretty good when we put them in the washing machine, but if you have a red towel that likes to bleed on your laundry, don't use that one. You can use sweater drying racks. This is something else you can get at the hardware store for drying on. There's lots of options, but photographs are especially good candidates for clothesline drying. And you kind of want to put your clothespin in a corner where if it does make a dent or if the emulsion sticks to the clothespin, you're going to be okay with that. You don't want to stick it over somebody's face. But you can run clothesline back and forth and really get a lot of drying space that way. Yes, did you have a question?
Yeah, your explanation of everything is excellent. I have 2 questions.
Yes.
If a photograph is within and concealed like plastic,
Great question.
how that would work. And also, how long, if you have them in your contents and they're getting dry, can you get them back to original, or not original, but seeable? How long a period can that go? Because there's a lot of other things that are more important in this time.
So that's where freezing is really going to be helpful. If you can freeze those items, that's going to buy time for them not to grow mold.
So what is the freezing?
So I'll get to that in just a second. So, let's go to your first question about what do you do with photographic albums that often have, a plastic sleeve.
If I could just, sorry, before we go into that too, just one other note about the drying process too, is that the great thing about these racks and about putting them on the clotheslines is that it allows for greater air circulation in the room. So in order to speed up the drying process and make it, more timely and efficient, you can have a fan going in the room. So just have it pointing upwards and circulating the air around. Just don't point it directly on any of the photos. And you'll hear that repeated throughout. But you want to increase air circulation throughout the drying process.
And if you have a dehumidifier spare, which you probably don't, you can use that too to keep the relative humidity down. And these photographs will be dry in a couple of hours easily. Oh, you do have one? Yeah. Okay. So if you have an album like this, this is something, if I retrieve this from the flood, and I did some of this last week, you might want to just put this whole thing in the freezer until you have more time. And then, when you've got time, you would take out a couple of the sleeves from the freezer, and I would take probably a pair of scissors. You want to cut the plastic away so that you're not trying to pull the wet or slightly damp photograph out. So you can cut it with scissors or an X-Acto knife, and then you would just gently peel that plastic away from the surface of the photograph. Paying attention to whether or not is it starting to stick, is it resistant, and then you would put it in the bath and let it soak. So that's really
The whole plastic sleeve you would put in there?
you wouldn't want to try to force the photograph out. You would just put the whole thing in there, give it some time. You could if you had a lot of time on your hands, you could pull it back to where it was stuck, cut the plastic, and that's going to let the water flow in more easily. It really depends on the scale of what you're dealing with. So they're drying, you'll probably be surprised at how little time it does take, so you can really set up sort of a production line and move things through. So I'm going to talk a little bit, when you're drying, you do want to dry them face up so that they don't stick to the surface of what you're drying them on. We don't really like to dry any of these materials in direct sunlight. It's also very difficult to work outside because it's windy, it might rain, there are bugs. So really an inside space is your best place for doing this phase of salvage. So I'm going to jump in and talk about freezing, which you'll hear us say over and over. So as Caitlin said, what freezing does, it's not going to solve the problem. It's a way to buy time. So I did a lot of this with this particular flood response, salvaging the wet paper items, photographs, books. We don't have the time or space to get them dry right away. So what we want to do is put them in a place where they'll remain stable and they won't grow mold. So that at another time and place when we have space and just the mental capacity and the help, then we can get them out in small batches from a freezer and then go through the same process. So for most of these materials, we like to use freezer paper, which you can usually get at a hardware store. You can also use wax paper. But the idea with freezing is that you would take sort of a manageable number of materials, preferably light, like if you had a bunch of documents that were wet, you would pack those up together. If you have time and space, you might want to try to interleave them. You might not. You might just have a whole stack of wet papers or wet photographs, and you're going to wrap them up in this freezer paper. You can use like painter's tape to seal the package. And I like to write on them just something so that when I go to get them out of the freezer 2 months from now,
Freezer bags,
a year from now, what is in that package? I currently have 2 collections in my home freezer. And you can then, once you've wrapped up your package of wet papers or photographs, tape them up, then you can put them in a Ziploc bag, write the contents. You might want to write the date.
This is exterior grade tape as well, so this is for your exterior. This will stay on, this will keep in the freezer as well. It won't come unstuck.
So photographs, and these techniques, that you have slides or other film negatives, this process can be used in exactly the same way. So I'm going to jump into books. This is sort of probably a good time to talk about, like, do you save your paperback book collection? Probably not. And that's something that can be hard to remember when you're in that initial phase of salvaging, is what's replaceable, what isn't. When is it that the physical piece of paper with the writing is the important thing, and when is it just that the information is the important thing? These are all things to think about. Right? And sometimes it's helpful to have another person who's stuck. It is not to help you kind of work through that thought process. So if this was a rare book or a family Bible or something that was really important to you, you would think about
My father-in-law wrote that one, so we're
It's
selling
the signed copy, you know. So this book is really saturated. If I were responding to this in a disaster, this is something that I would wrap up in freezer paper and freeze it, because this is going to take a long time to dry out, and it takes a lot of space. If this was the only thing that got wet, I might think about rinsing it. Typically when we rinse books, we want to keep them closed and just kind of dip the edges, which is hopefully where most of the silty muck is. Go through the same series of baths. This book is really wet. Again, this was the only book that got wet. You could be creative and blot each page with paper towels to help remove some of that initial water. I've also used hair dryers when I've had only like 3 or 4 books that got wet. Not on high heat, but sort of low heat or no heat in the low air. Again, it sort of depends on like the scale of the disaster you're responding to. This is another technique that works really well. If you have sort of damp books that are strong enough to stand up, you can dry them by standing them up on their end and fanning out the pages. This is where it's nice to have something that does allow airflow from both sides. If you don't have something like that, you just have to remember, partway through the drying process, you're gonna turn it over so that the bottom of the book also has an equal opportunity to dry out. What do wet books look like once they're dry? They're going to look like this. So this, if this is acceptable, if you want to still be able to read this, and this is something that Caitlin personally salvaged that was her own, it's still a totally functional book. If this was a book where this mattered, this is where a conservator could then help out and get the pages flat again. But a lot of times it's just returning it to a usable state, or to a state where you can get the information out into a different format. So packing for freezing, whether it's books.
Do you want to do interleaving as well?
Sure. So we're gonna move this.
This is another option for drying wet books. Also, too, to note that I think it can be sometimes surprising that when you go back to your bookshelf after a flood and you start pulling your books out and looking at them, you'll start looking and you'll see that the inside of them, when you open them up, and I don't recommend opening them until after you've rinsed, because otherwise if you do open, you can get all of the things that are on the outside inside, and that's what you don't want to have happen. But when you do open it, you'll see that they're actually, especially towards the binding, they're really not that wet. So the drying process might be a lot quicker than you sort of assume, even though they've been fully submerged, because they've been placed together on a shelf and they've been in, the water is not going to be seeping all the way through.
And the covers are doing their job.
Exactly, yeah.
So sometimes with wet books where that's happened, it'll really be the first and last, 20 pages that are wet.
Yeah.
So you can open it out. This is where the interleaving with paper towels works great. If it's really wet, you want to change that paper toweling out just with new dry towels so you don't create a damp environment for it to get moldy. But you can interleave. Paper towels, really probably the most readily available good thing to choose. We prefer not to use ones with printed image because hopefully those printing inks aren't soluble, but you don't want to find out the wrong way, then now you have Mickey Mouse or whoever all over your book pages. So that's another method for drying out books. You can also do this if this book was frozen. You can take it out of the freezer. You want to let it completely thaw before you start interleaving, but that just buys you some time. So wrapping it up, it's really simple. We all wrap packages. If you're using the freezer paper, you'll see that one side is shiny, and that's what I like to put against whatever it is I'm wrapping up. It's less likely to stick. And you really just wrap it up, put your tape on the edges, and make a nice tiny package. It's very challenging to use tape when you're wearing gloves, but it can be done. Or you can have a friend that is tearing the tape for you. That's something we did when I did a big archives retrieval. We tag teamed it and had one person who was not wearing gloves and handling the tape, and the other person was handling the contaminated objects. So you tape up your book. You might write on the cover what the title is or some sort of identifying information. I usually just put this in a Ziploc bag, just if I'm storing things from different places. You don't have to, that this could go right into your freezer. This is a good time to say you don't want to store your flood contaminated objects with your food. So emptying out the freezer or finding a friend with an empty chest freezer, that's really what you want to do. You don't want to put, even if it's wrapped in a Ziploc bag, I really don't recommend putting your flood contaminated things in the freezer with things that you and your family are going to eat. Books. So documents, I'll just quickly do this, more of the same techniques. So here, again, it's sort of thinking about, here's a folded up document. We've pulled it out of the floodwater. You don't want to start unfolding it right away. Paper is stronger. I should have had my screen over here. When it's wet. So if you have something that's folded or crumpled up, you want to get it into that initial tray of water first, and then you can do your unfolding. So I'm unfolding this guy. rinsing. And paper, especially more so than photographs, you really don't want to handle a wet piece of paper without a support unless there's no way to avoid that. If this was silty, you could again use your brush to remove some of that particulate material. One thing that we talk about is solubility of the inks. If your paper documents have gotten wet, so these are some things that were retrieved from this most recent flooding in Proctorsville. This is what I talk about what I mean when I talk about solubility. So I know that these inks are very soluble. These have gotten wet to this point in the paper. So I probably would not, if I was retrieving this, and I did retrieve this, I did not rinse this any further because I didn't want the rest of the inks to bleed. And you can actually still read this, what's left. So the information is still here. So this can be transcribed. These are paint formulas.
My plan was to photocopy the stuff after.
Yeah, so that's
I had a
like
bunch of them, it's like that.
a really good thing to think about is like, again, like can you reformat it?
Perfect.
And this project, I retrieved probably 500 of these formulas. And before I got them, the ones that I did wash, I just took a photograph of it with my phone so that if something did happen that I didn't expect, I still had all these, 0.04%. It's a very precise formula. I still had a record of that information. These could also, so these were actually in binder sleeves, not this binder sleeve, so that's another example of like I cut the sides of the plastic sleeve, peeled it off, and then took my document out.
And it might be helpful too when you're doing your salvage, right? You'll have those pieces, those documents that you just want the information off of, right? The recipes or the whatever it is that you have you. And then you have the other ones, a handwritten manuscript or, a graduation certificate or whatever it is. And this is the good time to, again, start thinking about prioritization. Maybe you want to focus your efforts only on saving a handful of these documents and really putting your extra effort into these ones, and then taking photos or photocopies or whatever it is of the rest so that you can make sure that you can, again, make the things that you want to keep the actual physicality of it in the best shape possible.
And half of these are currently in my freezer, waiting for me to have more time. So again, if you can find freezer space, it's really, really so helpful. So if I'm doing my paper documents, I'm in my last phase here, taking it out. You can take your paper toweling and you can do a little blotting. Like I said, we wouldn't do this with photographs because the emulsion is probably sticky. And then I might take some dry paper towels, pretend these are my dry paper towels now, and then I want to take my screen off because I want to keep using it. And I would just flip it over and peel that off slowly from the back, and then you can just keep going. Anything paper?
You can too for this, you can put like another layer of paper towels over it, and if you want to try it, this is going to, again, similar to the book, it's not ever going to be flat and perfect again, but if you want to try to achieve that, again, I'm thinking like certificates or again, handwritten documents, you can take a piece of like Flexi or something level and hard and place it over it with something heavy on top of that. Again, we're replacing the paper towels as they absorb the water, and as the moisture begins to come out, the paper itself will begin to dry and flatten somewhat to its original shape.
As I ran out of space, I took a laundry line, the ones that go in the house, and just hung the paper over. I thought, okay, it's not going to be flat, but it'll dry, and I can then keep the information.
And another trick, if you want it to be flat, you've got to dry initially. On a humid day, the paper is going to be nice and relaxed. And then when you have that humid piece of paper, you can do the paper towels and the heavy weight on top, and it will get much better. But yeah. So
one thing I think we just didn't talk about with photos there is also, so you have photos in freestyle photos like the globs that you saw here. We saw photos in albums, but we also have photos in frames, and these can get damaged as well. I don't know if you want to go through
Sure. So wet photographs really like to stick to glass as they dry. So this is again a case, and I can tell this one has stuck to the glass. But if this is still wet, with any sort of framed material, you want to get it out of the frame because all those boards and papers behind the frame are moisture traps and it can't dry. So if this was wet, I would want to take all these extra materials out. I would take it out so that the glass and the photograph came out together, and I would probably just put that in the tray of water and just see what happened instead of trying to separate
If
it.
it's stuck to the glass, can it be removed in water?
It can't, not always, so that it usually.
I would say maybe even before you put it in the glass, I would take a photo of it.
Yeah.
Like I would do your best to at least document what the photo itself was, and then you can try to maybe yourself, because this isn't. Unsticking these in water has a much better likelihood of coming off of the glass.
So and that's what we do all the time in the studio too. We would photograph this first, even just with your phone. All of those cameras are pretty darn good. Then I would put the photograph and the glass in the water together. And this is where I have had to leave them overnight. And sometimes it's just a matter of time. Mm-hmm. If it doesn't work, you have that image on your phone that you can make a new print from.
Yeah.
But frame things, usually when you're doing retrieval, if they're important, one of the priorities is getting those out of the frame so they can start drying sooner rather than later.
Great. So we can talk, we have a few more different media to cover, and so the next thing that we'll go over is textiles. And so these are your garments. These can be quilts, shawls, embroidered objects, wedding gowns, uniforms, what have you. Typically when you're taking these out of a salvage, and my textile has already drank up most of the water in this bath, but you'll see that like every other object that we pulled out of here, the fibers are the most weak when they've been wet. So we don't want to be pulling them out, by a weak edge or by a different part. This is going to be when the garment is, or the fabric is most susceptible to pulls or to distortion. The fabric itself is at its most vulnerable state. So this is again where a piece of porch screen is going to come in super handy. This I know is big, even though it's in a glob, I know it's large. I'm going to get a bigger piece of porch screen in order to hold it. I think this one, nope, this one, you're right. We'll get a nice large piece that I can handle and manipulate it with eventually. And again, I'm going to just try to maybe even take it out entirely. I'm not going to try to spread it out just yet. I'll put it under the porch screen into its first bath, and again, once it's in the water, I'll start the manipulation process of trying to spread it out. And so Carolyn grabbed another thing right here. This is just pipe insulation. This is a really great tool, and we recommend this for a lot of different things. But it's a good support system for things like textiles. I don't want to get your page too wet here, sorry. And it's great for laying over. You'll see that we'll be using that for drying in a little bit. So again, it's in the bath. I'm both cleaning it and trying to spread it out on this porch screen. And we'll move it into the second bath right now. It's already a little bit more mobile, and second bath.
And another thing I'll say, so textiles are often bigger than your paper and books.
Definitely.
So you might even just use like any kind of plastic bin. You might use a plastic kiddie pool. If you are working on like a really big object like a quilt, this is where you might be working outside because you have no other options, and you would put down a tarp, ideally on a little bit of a slope. And this is where, like, realistically, you're probably going to be using water from the hose. You could pour jugs of distilled water, but I think from a practical standpoint, you're probably going to be using
your hose.
The hose. So
if you do use your hose, don't point it. Don't get within 3 inches of your thing and really spray it down. Do it from a distance. You're really just intending to get the rinse out. You could do damage if you get a lot closer. So I'm going to move all of your materials here, if that's okay, and lay out my sandwich system, if that's okay. Yeah. So I have already opened this up, but notice one of the things too that we're going to do for drying is I'm not going to be wringing this out. Again, that's going to cause damage to the fibers. We're going to do a nice simple rolling technique, which you could use. So basically what you're going to do is you'll take a white towel. Again, Carolyn mentioned this earlier. Probably most of your bath towels would be okay. We recommend white just in case. Definitely not the red towel that bleeds over all of your clothes or anything like that. White towels here, and then if you want to grab another set of hands, we'll move this over. It is going to be wet still. We'll let it.
And this is where I think it's tempting to.
It is. It really is. Yeah.
It's better.
We'll get it back onto here. We can flip it too, actually, or we can just gently bring it down, bring it off. Move our fourth screen. We're gonna lay this out as best we can.
Do you have cheesecloth?
I do, and so then I'm gonna grab a piece of cheesecloth here. So this is again just something you can pick up at your, I bought this at Walmart. What this is gonna do is it's both gonna protect any of the delicate, fragile pieces that's on the cloth. It's also gonna absorb any dyes that could be transferable. So it's gonna make sure that if one section is blue, that section stays blue and it doesn't make the white part there. So it'll absorb anything that is looking to move. Lay another piece of towel over it and then just use the paint roller and then gently press the water out like this. And again, you can do this multiple times in multiple steps and stages, right? So you'll get near to seeing that this towel is becoming saturated with use. So you're gently pressing, applying a little bit of pressure, trying to get it out. So you'll do that, then you can grab another dry towel. You can do the same process again. Lay the towel flat over it, and you're just getting the garment out, the water out that way. This isn't gonna completely dry the object, the textile, but it'll get it to a place where it's a lot more easy to handle. So this is again a great time too for your pipe insulation to come in handy if you'd like. Oh, you laid it out already?
And I would say if you're doing textiles, you definitely want a buddy because they're often big. Even this small, relatively small, very old, dark
Yes.
important scarf.
Yes.
It's really safer to handle with
Definitely.
2 pairs of hands.
So now that it's like a little bit more dry, we can fold it into some more manageable pieces if it's something like that. We're gonna gently support it as much as possible, holding underneath. The two of us will move it over here. Let's pretend this is just your regular old chain link fence. If you wanna take, and again, excuse the handling here, but if you wanna just take this pipe insulation and lay it over the top, that will prevent any snags from the metal catching on it. It also makes sure that when it dries, it's not gonna, we can lay it, sorry. When it dries, it's not gonna have a crease in it. And so you won't have any of those like fine points. You were talking about like paper over a clothesline, but acknowledging that that is going to have a crease in it. It would be the same thing with the textile too. If you laid a carpet over a clothesline, it's gonna have that hard crease right down it. A piece of pipe insulation or something similar will really soften that edge and make it a bit more pliable later on. Another thing you can do with textiles is like many other items, and excuse my rough handling, you can freeze them. So if you want to come back to it at a later time, feel free. Take your textile, and again, let's just pretend this is entirely laid out, don't mind the fold. But what you would do is you take a piece of freezer paper and you can fold it into your desired shape in order to get into the freezer. You're not gonna obviously get a thing, that looks like this size into a freezer. Fold it up with a layer of freezer paper in between. I'll just do this. Great. We'll want to avoid any intricate details or delicate spots. So let's pretend that this is a nice safe place to make a fold. We'll fold it over here. You can get another piece of paper, put it here, fold it back, and then you can put it into the freezer. Again, another piece of paper here. This is going to make sure that when you take it out of the freezer, these edges aren't sticking to each other. So if you want to put it in, make sure that whatever you need to not stick is interleaved with a piece of freezer paper.
And just like your paper materials that you freeze, you want to make sure when you go to get this out to do the rest of the drying, you let it completely thaw out.
Absolutely.
Because otherwise, when you hit those sections where it's more frozen, like in the middle, it's likely to tear.
Right. Okay. We are getting low on time, so I'm
So
gonna.
they're okay to, after they have been rinsed out, those are okay then to sun dry if you want?
That's a great question. Fabrics, please do not put fabrics in the sun. Any of your textile materials are susceptible to sun damage. It's not likely, right? It would have to stay out for like 6+ hours. Right. I would put it, if I were drying it on a fence, I would put it in a shady spot under a tree. Let's put it that way.
If
And I would
you
let it go.
can.
If you can, yeah.
That's like
Absolutely,
to be
yeah.
realistic too. So
Totally.
if you only have a big field with sun and that's your only place
There
to
you go.
dry, then
I can't recommend putting it in a sunny spot, but it will likely,
Sun's not gonna stay in the same spot.
You're exactly
Right.
Okay, yeah, no, that's a great point. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
So I'll quickly, so next thing that we have, and again, I'm gonna go a little bit more zippy right now because we are running out of time. One of the next things that you might salvage is paintings. This is gonna be very different than a lot of your, and pretend this is a painting with me, okay? It's beautiful. This is gonna be very different than a lot of the other materials that we've worked with. What you're gonna do is you're gonna make sure that when you're holding it, you're supporting it as best you can. We're not rinsing paintings off, okay? If you want, you can take a dry brush and try to remove some of it. Again, that's if you'd like, we don't entirely recommend it. It's a good idea to test the small corner, and it also depends on what kind of paint.
And I think I would let it dry completely.
So this is, yeah, so let's pretend this is still wet. We're still salvaging this. This is still wet. We're just gonna rinse, we're gonna let any material, any water drip off of it. Okay, we're still supporting it from its frame. Another thing too is that if this, let's pretend this had a really beautiful ornate frame around it, okay? With the photos and things, we've been removing the photos from the frames. We're gonna keep the painting in the frame. And that's because it's going to help maintain its shape as it dries. These things are made of, you know, particulate wood, the frames themselves, once they get wet, they're susceptible to warping. So the more support that you can give a painting, the better. It'll have a better chance of drying intact, so you see. So this will stay in the frame itself as we dry it. Again, you're holding it, depending on how big it is, you might need to have 2 people hold it because your edges and your corners here, thank you. Yeah, what is this word? These are going to be your most fragile points. This is going to be where it wants to fall apart. So make sure that you have folks on hand to do this. For paintings, if it's looking like it's in okay shape, then you can dry it upright. And I'm just going to grab 2 of those. These are just regular sponges, but you can set these up and you can dry it on these against the wall, rest it on these, and lay it back against the wall.
Your airflow.
Exactly, so this gets it underneath, it gets it behind, and again, you're just trying to do a slow dry with this to see how it handles. If it's not gonna be able to dry upright, feel free to grab a few more sponges and set up a small drying rack just like this. Again, all 4 corners are supported under here, but you still have good air circulation all around the painting. So again, this is for paintings. Paintings cannot be frozen, okay? So we don't put paintings in the freezer. Again, we're not rinsing them, okay? And we're also not removing them from frames. So they are a very different beast than a lot of
And that's really probably where once it's dry, or if you have paintings that are important to you, you would really want to reach out to a conservator early on in this process, because they can come in and help with some more technical techniques and do some conservation after it's done.
Definitely. A few more things that we have. We have electronic media. Okay, so these are our CDs, DVDs, VHS, albums. I'm not going to get this wet, although it would be fun. This is also going to go through our 3 rinse system. One of the things to keep in mind with these is they can tolerate rinses just like everything else, but because they're so susceptible to damaging the information, this is where they store their stuff, for lack of a better word, right? You just want to be careful with the way you're holding it. So I'm just holding the edges. This is how you typically hold a CD, but these can go through the wash system. Again, you're looking at your brush here. You can gently scrape off any kind of gunk, but just be careful on, again, the media holding side, for lack of a better word, I'm sure.
And these, if you have a bunch and you were trying to dry them, you can take a piece of string and go through the hole and then
put it straight there. Yeah, exactly. I am taking them out of any of their coverings. So if it's a CD, I'm taking it out of its sleeve. You can decide if you need to save the sleeve or not. You would just treat it as you would a document. This is not what you're supposed to do in order to get it out. But you would gently sort of remove the CD from its sleeve. And then this could be treated like a document as far as rinsing and flattening and interleaving goes through there. Same thing with your records. Again, just remove it from its sleeve. And this again can be treated like a document. I would maybe suggest putting a piece of paper towel in between here if it's at all possible, and getting it to dry flat like that.
Yeah, and you can do the same thing with the string through the hole.
Same thing, string through the hole with this guy. VHSs and cassette tapes are a little bit more tricky. What you would do, and I'm sorry I don't have an example to show you, is you can rinse the entire VHS. You would also, again, take the VHS out of its sleeve, but you would not take any of the reels outside of the case of the VHS machine. Does that make sense?
You don't want to pull the tape.
Yeah, you don't want to pull the tape at all. So you'll wash off the encasement, okay, but you won't actually remove any of the film from either of those types of media. Let's see. Let's talk about furniture real quick, and I have an example of just wood, but here, if we want to look at, this is a really nice big object that I'll just ask you to, once again, use your imagination for. This is, let's pretend this is a old dresser that you would like to keep. Let's say the water damage was up to yay high. What I'd recommend doing is taking a sponge, using some clean water, again, distilled is likely best, but just rinsing off any of the gunk that's gotten on it. You can pour some water on it again. I wouldn't recommend getting anything that wasn't wet before wet at all, but if it's been wet, yes, please do rinse it off. Again, you're gonna wanna elevate your furniture, so it likely won't be supported with a piece of sponge, but I actually like to use like yoga blocks or something for this. Those are actually very sturdy as far as holding up this.
If you have spare like 2x4s, or I mean,
Yep.
it's often like what you have available to
Yep.
you.
Totally.
But it's like about getting the air circulation, especially like if it was a dresser that had a solid
Yeah.
bottom. Really
Absolutely.
get that
Yep.
airflow going.
So if it's a dresser, you can pull out the drawers, okay, to help with increasing the drying, but don't remove them entirely. Because again, you're gonna wanna support the structure itself. It's wood, it's going to be prone to warping once it's been water damaged. So pull the drawers out, but keep them actually inserted within the piece of furniture in order for it to help retain its shape. And again, you're looking for air circulating and moving around the room, but not directly on the piece of furniture. And this is also important because wood especially wants to take its time when drying. So you don't want to be placing a piece of furniture like this in the sunlight or with a direct fan on it. This wants a very nice, slow and steady drying process, maybe even over the course of a day or two or more, in order to make
The
sure.
faster it dries, the more likely it is to warp.
Exactly.
So this is where you want slow.
Slow drying for the
Slow
big
drying.
pieces of furniture and wood. So that's that. And then, let's see, I think the last few things I have are very, pretty simple to go through. One is ceramics. Ceramics are one of the best things that you can salvage because they're the easiest, right? These can very simply be rinsed off any toxins, any material that's on it.
Brush.
Rinse it off with the brush, yep, plop it in the sun or anywhere you have space and let it dry. Ceramics, done. On the opposite side of that is leather, which you may or may not ever be able to get back to the same shape or use or functionality that it was before. What we recommend doing is not even rinsing with this unless you, actually no, we don't really recommend rinsing it. You can take a brush, again, similar to the paintings, and try to get any material off of it that you can. Pipe insulation can also work really well for these. What you want to do is you want to be able to create as much airflow as you possibly can while retaining the shape, the desired shape of the object. So if it's a pair of leather boots, or if it's a leather handbag, or
Hat.
yeah, exactly. You want to get it into the shape that you're trying to accomplish with something like pipe insulation and creating airflow at the same time. With leather especially, you may need to, again, agitate it as it dries. Otherwise, once it fully dries, it is more prone to cracking and breaking. You've all seen what dried leather looks like. But if you continue to move it during the process, rubbing, a little bit of oil or something like that can go a long way for these kinds of things. That's leather. I think that's it as far as items go. The one other thing that I'll add is that when we were talking about books, we forgot to mention that there are different kinds of books that are made with a kind of paper that's called clay-coated paper. Yearbooks are a great example of them. Your beautiful coffee table books, things like this.
Glossy photograph.
Glossy, gorgeous, whatever you have that you think of as a really nice book, it probably has clay-coated pages. These are some of the most difficult items to salvage because once the pages get wet and they dry, any conservator would tell you that they're almost impossible to get apart again. So if you are prioritizing your salvage and you come across a clay-coated book, if the pages are still wet, do your best to extricate it. What you'll want to do is you can take freezer paper or wax paper, and you'll want it as much as you're able, interleave between each single page in order to prevent them from sticking to each other. And then this is a good candidate again for freezing. So you'll want to again interleave every page, wrap it in your freezer paper and put it in the freezer so that you can deal with it at a later time. But once these pages dry together, it's
They like form a mass of
big
very hard stuck together paper that you just can't, even if you get it wet again, it doesn't come apart in a way that doesn't peel.
Yeah, exactly. That was a lot of information. Sorry to bulldoze you with that sort of thing. We're happy to take questions, or if you want to come up here and have some fun with any of the materials. We also have some handouts over on this table. These are 2 fact sheets from FEMA about salvaging family heirlooms. Take them with you. They're also available on FEMA's website. If you Google HENTEF, Heritage Emergency National Task Force, fact sheets after the flood, you can typically find them. They're available on FEMA's website as well. And there's some other resources up there.
Is that website you just mentioned, which is long, is it in that paper?
Yes, it is. It's on the pages. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I have a bookmark that you're also welcome to email me or call me, and I can give you a bunch of resources.
Yeah.
Too, if you're having trouble finding them, I've got them all.
Yeah,
ready to go.
absolutely.
So.
When you're talking about freezing, with food, you're only supposed to freeze it for a certain amount of time. Sometimes because of the quality of the food, but sometimes it will eventually start throwing
Right.
something. How long can you freeze these things?
Forever.
Okay.
I mean,
Like
sometimes.
you're like, man, I've just got so many things. They're gonna be a couple of years. As
Yeah.
long as the freezer's still working, it's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
absolutely.
it's, sometimes that time in the freezer will work to your advantage, and the same way like this, your meat is drying out and getting freezer burns, some of that
It dries
is
out
going
some
to
a little bit here and
dry
there.
out. So if you had something that was kind of minimally damp, and you put it in the freezer, probably in a couple of months, it's gonna be almost dry when you thaw it and take it out to dry. It won't take long at all. So
Yeah.
time can actually be an advantage if you have time in the space.
And when you are
It doesn't
freezing, sorry.
Dry it for you.
No, yeah.
No,
It's-
it gives you,
yeah.
More
It
time
does,
is
yeah.
often better.
Yeah.
Okay.
When you do take items out of the freezer too, so whether it's a pile of documents or a pile of photos, this goes back to the whole having a plan thing, because once you take them out of the freezer, they have to be dealt with, right? You bring them to room temperature and then you begin your cleaning and your drying process. You can't bring them out and put them back in again, okay? Because we're manipulating microclimates and none of it is good and safe for any of the objects. So yeah, when you take it out, and that's why putting them in with a plan is also good. If you have a stack of documents this big, maybe don't freeze them as a lump, because then you're gonna have to take them out as a lump and deal with them like that again. Do a manageable quantity with every freezer
And to me,
possible.
like a manageable quantity to do at home would be like 10 to 20 pieces of paper or photographs. So you can just slowly pick away at it.
Thank you guys so
Yeah,
much.
thank
We
you.
appreciate it.